presentation is going to cover the teaching of productive skills. To start with, if we think about the way in which you learnt your first language, most of us go through a particular process. Firstly, we listen to those around us. After that first silent period of listening to other people, then we start to make utterances. Having learnt to speak, to a certain extent at least, we then go on to learn how to read and to write. And this process that we go through is actually covering the 4 skills that we're trying to teach with our English students. So we have listening, speaking, reading and writing. If we group those skills into their different types, then the 2 skills of reading and listening are known as receptive skills, whereas the skills of speaking and writing are known as productive skills. In this session, we're going to focus on the production skills and have a look at how to create a lesson for that. So we'll focus first of all on a speaking skills lesson. And perhaps a starting point for this would be to ask a question, which is, why do we speak to each other? The reason that it's important to ask ourselves this question is that whatever answers there are to this should be present in our lessons. So, why do we speak to each other? Well, there are a multitude of answers to that, but when you boil them all down to their essence, they probably actually come down to one of 2 things. We communicate to each other via speaking because of either a need, we need something, we want something, or a desire to achieve something. Before we move on to the planning of a lesson for speaking skills, something that we need to look at first is the idea of the accuracy versus the fluency of speaking. Accuracy relates to the correct usage of grammar and vocabulary, whereas fluency relates to our ability to continue speaking without any interruption. Now, ultimately, within a whole ESA lesson, or within language learning itself, fluency and accuracy are equally important. Within an ESA lesson, however, depending upon which stage we're at in that lesson, then we're either focusing on accuracy or we're focusing on fluency. Remember, in the ESA lesson, in the study phase, this is where we're looking at the target language, where we're doing our language learning. So it's very important in this stage that we focus on the accuracy of the language. Whereas in the activate stage, we're trying to get the students to use the language in a realistic way, and what we want them to do there is to focus on fluency. So speaking activities will come in many different forms, but we can generalize them into 3 basic types. Controlled activities tend to be used in the study phase, and here the teacher will be helping the students in terms of what they need to say and how they go about saying it. So there's a high level of structure within a controlled activity. A guided activity has slightly less structure than this, and it can be used in either the study or the activate stages themselves. The final type of activity, or class of activity, is called a creative activity, and this one would be used in the activate phase. In a creative activity, we're giving a scenario or a very small amount of structure, and we're asking the students to actually create their own answers to this particular question. Regardless of whether your activity is controlled, guided, or creative, there are a number of things that you need to make sure are in place before you could expect the students to actually start them. So the first thing goes back to the reasons why we communicate in the first place. There is little point asking our students to create a speaking activity unless there is some need or desire to do that. So we have to make sure that we generate interest in this particular activity before we actually start. The second thing, do our students have the language knowledge that is necessary in order to be able to complete such a speaking activity? If they have a lack of grammar knowledge or a lack of vocabulary knowledge around this particular speaking activity, it's going to be very, very difficult for them. Thirdly, when asking the students to create language in terms of a speaking activity, it's always very useful to put them in pairs. By putting them in pairs, you allow them to interact and therefore gain even more speaking practice, but also you reduce stress because all of the effort is not concentrated on a single individual. So let's consider now a typical speaking lesson and the stages that we need to go through from the very start until the finish. Before the lesson even takes place, there are a number of things that you need to have considered. Obviously, you need a very clear idea of what it is you're expecting the students to have to do, and they need to know why. It's very important before you ask them to do an activity that they have an understanding of the purpose of that activity. You should secondly have had a thought about what they already know. Linked to that is, will it be necessary to do any form of pre-teaching before I can expect them to do this activity? And finally, we need to make sure that we have prepared all our materials and our instructions for this particular activity. So, we'll consider a straight arrow ESA lesson, the focus of which is to be speaking skills. So we'll start with our engage. And in a typical lesson, what we might do is ask our students about the weather in their country and if they know anything about the weather in any other countries. So throughout this engage phase, what we can be doing is to be drawing information out from the students, getting that information up onto the board and starting to generate some interest in the topic itself. Once we're satisfied that all the students have been engaged and that they've been given the opportunity to say something, we can move on to our study phase. Here, it may be necessary or useful to actually pre-teach some gaps in knowledge that have been shown from the engage phase. And those gaps in knowledge may include actual grammar structures or indeed useful vocabulary. And it's very important that before we move on to doing any forms of activity, that we check their understanding of this material. So we need to do some study exercises. It's also very useful if you leave this information up on the board for that study period. Those study activities can just be the normal types of gap fills or matching activities, and as always we need to demonstrate those activities, elicit correct answers before we actually give out the material, and once they are doing the activity, monitor. When it's complete, we can then feed back and correct as necessary. The final stage of the lesson will be the activate, and the activate phase is going to form the main speaking activity within the lesson. So it's very, very important that here we do a good demonstration of what it is that we're expecting them to do, that we elicit the type of target language we're expecting them to produce from the activity. So one way we could go around it is to firstly form pairs. Each pair is going to be given a card, and onto that card they're going to write a country and a month. What the teacher can then do, just to add a little bit of spice to it, is to collect all of the cards in, shuffle them around and then redistribute them to the pairs so that they get a card that doesn't have their country or their month on it. What they're then going to do is to be asked to create a weather forecast for that country in that particular month. Now obviously this will be written down, and once all of the students have completed their forecast, what we can then do is the main speaking activity where they would actually read out this particular information. So obviously we would need to feed back on that afterwards. If there are any common mistakes between all of these feedback sessions, then we can cover those after the session has finished. We're now going to move on to the